Welcome to Wisdom for the Present, where we take ancient truth and bring it into clear, modern understanding. This episode uses AI-generated narration based on human-researched and written material.
Right, so let's get right into it.
Yeah, I want you to just imagine for a second trying to start this totally puritanical religious movement.
Okay.
But you're trying to do it in the middle of modern-day Las Vegas.
Oh, wow.
Right, during spring break. And it's situated right on Wall Street.
That is quite a combination.
It's wild. You've got the insane wealth, the cutthroat corporate ambition, endless entertainment.
Yeah, a culture that just completely celebrates giving in to every single human appetite.
Exactly. And that is exactly what the Apostle Paul was trying to do in first century Corinth.
It really was.
So that's what we're digging into today. We are taking a deep dive into the ancient text of 1 Corinthians, specifically chapters 7 through 11.
And it is packed. I mean, it is just packed with practical stuff.
It's so packed. Our mission here is to basically act as guides for you, the listener. We want to extract the practical wisdom, the moral insight, the real-life application from these ancient writings.
Right, to help you navigate our incredibly complex modern world.
Because, honestly, the world you live in right now has a lot more in common with ancient Corinth than you might initially think.
Oh, it's uncanny. I mean, and environments are so parallel.
Yeah.
Yeah, totally. Because to actually understand the advice Paul is giving in this text, you have to mentally step into the streets of that city.
Walk me through it. What's it look like?
Well, Corinth wasn't some quiet, isolated, pious village out in the desert.
Right.
It was this absolute powerhouse of a city. Geographically, it sat right on an isthmus.
Which is a narrow strip of land, right?
Exactly. A narrow strip of land between two major bodies of water, the Aegean Sea and the Ionian Sea.
Okay, so if you're trading goods anywhere in the known world, your cargo is definitely passing through Corinth.
Precisely. I mean, they actually had this paved trackway called the Diolkos.
The Diolkos?
Yeah, and they would literally drag entire ships across the land on this track to avoid the treacherous sea journey around the southern tip of Greece.
Wait, they dragged whole ships across the land?
Whole ships. It was a massive center for global trade. So it was funneling just staggering amounts of wealth right into the city.
That's incredible.
But, with that global trade came sailors, merchants, freedmen, slaves, philosophers, just people from every single corner of the Roman Empire.
So it was incredibly pluralistic.
Highly pluralistic. It was loud, it was busy, and it was entirely organized around the worship of pagan gods.
Right.
Every guild, every market, every public event, it was deeply intertwined with some deity.
And we really can't gloss over the reputation of the city itself.
Oh, definitely not.
When I was looking through the historical context for this deep dive, the sheer scale of the vice was just staggering.
He was famous for it.
There was an actual verb coined in the ancient world, right? To Corinthianize.
Yes. To play the Corinthians.
Right. If someone said you were Corinthianizing, they were not complimenting your architecture.
No, they were not.
It literally meant you were engaging in extreme, uncontrolled sexual immorality and debauchery.
Yeah, our sources point out that looming right over the city was this massive rock outcropping called the Acrocorinth.
Okay.
And sitting right on top of that was the Temple of Aphrodite, the goddess of love.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And historical accounts suggest that at its peak, that temple housed 1,000 priestesses.
1,000.
1,000, and they functioned as prostitutes. That was the religious center of the city.
So you walk out your front door, and that is the world you were just swimming in.
It's the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters. I mean, imagine being a newly converted Christian in that specific environment.
The psychological whiplash must have been intense.
Oh, absolutely.
They're trying to figure out, okay, how do I live a pure life in a society that actively rewards, incentivizes, and just celebrates the exact opposite of everything I now believe?
Right.
How do you survive that? Do you just isolate yourself completely?
Pack up and leave.
Yeah. Do you pack up your family, leave your business, and move to a cave somewhere? Or, I don't know, do you just compromise a little bit here and there so you can still survive economically and socially?
And that tension right there, that is the driving force behind this entire section of the letter.
Really?
Yeah. The Corinthians had actually written a letter to Paul first.
Oh, so he's replying.
Exactly. They essentially sent him a list of these highly specific agonizingly practical questions about how to survive this culture.
Right, like, hey, Paul, we live in the shadow of Aphrodite's temple.
Our bosses worship Apollo. Our spouses are still sacrificing to Zeus.
How do we live here? What are the rules now?
And Paul's approach to answering that is just fascinating.
How so?
Well, he doesn't start by writing a manifesto on how to overthrow the local pagan government. He doesn't start by talking about reforming the massive temples. To answer the question of how you build a pure life in a chaotic world, he shrinks the focus all the way down.
To what?
To the most intimate sphere of human life, the private home, the marriage bed, and a person's individual calling.
Huh. That is a brilliant sociological strategy, actually.
Isn't it?
I mean, if your private world is chaotic, if your home is fractured, you have absolutely no anchor when you step out into the public square.
Exactly. You'll just be swept away by the culture.
So, chapter 7 begins with Paul directly answering their mail.
Yeah, he says, "Now concerning the things whereof you wrote unto me." And the very first item on the agenda is sex, marriage, and celibacy.
Which, given Corinth, makes total sense. And the context behind their questions is wild.
Very well.
The sources point out that there were likely two extreme factions pulling the Corinthian church apart.
Really carrying them in two different directions.
On one side, you had people of Jewish extraction who believed marriage was absolutely mandatory, like a divine command to multiply and to remain single was practically a sin.
Yes.
But then on the other side, you had people heavily influenced by Greek philosophy.
The dualists.
Exactly. This dualistic idea that the physical body, like matter itself, was inherently evil and only the spirit was good.
So that philosophical camp, they would argue that if the body is evil, then all physical intimacy, even within a marriage, is corrupt, or at least, a lower form of existence.
Right.
They were advocating for extreme asceticism, complete celibacy across the board.
So Paul steps right into the crossfire of this massive cultural debate.
He really does.
And he starts by acknowledging the ascetic side. He says, it is good for a man not to touch a woman.
We have to pause here.
Yeah, because to modern ears, that sounds like Paul is just flat out anti-marriage.
Right, but the historical commentators, like Matthew Henry, they are very careful to clarify this.
Right.
Paul is not saying marriage is a sin. I mean, in other letters, he calls marriage honorable and a profound mystery.
Yeah.
But he is acknowledging that, especially given what was happening in the first century, a single life has distinct tactical advantages.
But he's also a realist.
Oh, very much so. He knows exactly what city he's writing to. Because of the overwhelming, omnipresent temptation to sexual immorality in Corinth, he immediately follows up by saying, "Let every man have his own wife, and let every woman have her own husband."
He presents marriage as God's appointed remedy against all that surrounding chaos.
A provision for human flourishing in a deeply broken environment.
Exactly. But the way he describes how that marriage should function, that's what really caught my attention in the sources.
Why? What does he say? Well, when he talks about how husbands and wives should interact, he uses language that must have been a complete cultural earthquake back then.
An earthquake?
Yeah, he talks about rendering due benevolence, which means mutual affection and sexual intimacy.
Okay.
And then he says, "The wife hath not power of her own body, but the husband, and likewise also the husband hath not power of his own body, but the wife."
Oh, wow. Let's sit with that for a second, because the radical nature of that statement cannot be overstated.
It really can't.
In the Greco-Roman world, the patriarchal structure was absolute. I mean, under Roman law, the concept of paterfamilias meant the oldest living male had total, unquestioned authority over his household.
Total authority.
The woman had virtually no legal rights over her own life, let alone her husband's body.
Not at all.
The double standard was just baked right into the legal code. A man could have mistresses, visit temple prostitutes, do literally whatever he pleased, and it was perfectly socially acceptable.
And Paul shatters that completely.
He establishes a radical symmetry.
Yes. He looks at the Roman legal code and essentially says, no, the authority goes both ways.
Right.
As the historical commentary notes, this was the taking away of the tyranny of man over woman.
Wow.
He is telling these first century men, you don't belong to yourself anymore. You belong to her just as much as she belongs to you.
That the marriage tie is sacred and the rights are entirely mutual.
It's a total reimagining of power dynamics.
It really is.
And he gets very practical. He tells them they shouldn't defraud or deprive each other of this intimacy. The only exception is if they mutually agree, and again, mutual consent is the foundation here, to pause for a short, specific time to focus on fasting and prayer,
Okay.
And then they need to come back together.
Because Paul knows human nature.
He knows it well. If you try to enforce an unnatural asceticism, Satan will exploit your lack of self-control.
Matthew Henry has a really sharp observation on this in the sources.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, he points out that seasons of deep humiliation or intense spiritual focus might require temporary abstinence from lawful pleasures, but it must not be permanent.
Right.
If you attempt a level of severe deprivation that is way above your natural strength and is not commanded by God, you aren't being holy.
You're just exposing yourself to danger.
Exactly. Extreme danger. You might try to abstain from something good and lawful, only to find yourself ensnared by something deeply unlawful.
It is intensely pragmatic pastoral care.
Yeah,
But Paul also adds a caveat, which brings us back to his own preference.
the celibacy thing.
Right. He says, I speak this by permission and not of commandment. He is essentially saying, I wish everyone could be like me, meaning single and celibate.
Right.
But he recognizes that every man hath his proper gift of God.
A gift.
Yeah, some people have the gift of continence, the ability to thrive without sexual intimacy, and some simply don't.
I want to dig into that word gift, because usually when we talk about spiritual gifts, we think of things like, teaching or empathy or leadership.
Right, the usual ones.
But Paul views your natural constitutional makeup as a gift.
Yes. The commentator Albert Barnes brings this out beautifully. Natural constitutions vary wildly from person to person.
Sure.
If someone has a strong natural ability to remain single, focused, and content without a partner, they shouldn't view that as just a personality quirk.
Okay.
They should view it as a specific tactical gift from God to be utilized for a purpose.
Ah.
But if they don't have that specific constitutional makeup, Paul is blunt. It is better to marry than to burn.
All right. Meaning it is vastly better to pursue a wholly committed, faithful marriage than to be continually consumed by unfulfilled passions.
Because those passions will eventually lead you right into the destructive behaviors Corinth was famous for.
Okay, but this brings up a massive question for the modern listener.
Let's hear it.
Why is Paul pushing celibacy so hard here? Because, if you look at modern culture, we elevate romantic love, finding your soulmate, and achieving sexual fulfillment as the absolute pinnacle of human existence.
Oh, without a doubt. It's everywhere.
Every movie, every song, every advertisement tells us that if you haven't found romantic love, you haven't really lived.
Yeah.
And Paul is pushing back against that narrative with incredible force. He is elevating undivided devotion to God above romantic fulfillment.
He is.
But there is a very specific, terrifying historical reason for this, right?
Yeah.
He mentions the present distress.
And that phrase is the key to unlocking this whole chapter. I suppose, therefore, that this is good for the present distress.
What was the distress?
Yeah. Well, historians debate the exact timeline, but it is highly likely Paul is anticipating or already seeing the early rumblings of severe persecution.
Under the Romans.
Yes. The Roman Emperor Nero is coming to power, or is in power. The church is about to enter a period of horrific trauma.
Oh, wow.
Christians are going to be targeted, their property seized, they will be imprisoned, thrown to wild animals, and executed.
Okay, let me try to build an analogy here to help us grasp the psychological weight of this.
Go for it.
Isn't Paul basically acting like a modern startup advisor talking to a young, ambitious founder?
Okay, I like this.
The advisor sits him down and says, look, getting married and starting a family is a beautiful, wonderful thing. But right now, we are in the launch phase of a wildly risky company.
Right.
We're burning through cash, working 90-hour weeks, sleeping under our desks, and the stress is unimaginable. This is the absolute worst time to start a family because your focus will be violently divided. It's not that having a family is a bad thing. It's that the present distress, the critical, dangerous phase of the mission, requires undivided focus.
Yes.
The married person, naturally and rightly, has their focus divided because they are seeking to please and protect your spouse.
As they should.
Right. While the single person can focus entirely on surviving the mission.
That is an incredibly accurate translation of Paul's logic. He explicitly spells that out later in the chapter.
He does.
Yeah, he says, the unmarried person cares for the things of the Lord, how they may please the Lord. But the married person cares for the things of the world, how they may please their spouse.
Which makes total sense.
And think about that in the context of violent persecution. Having a spouse and children makes you infinitely more vulnerable to the empire.
It's leverage.
Exactly. It brings, as Paul says, trouble in the flesh.
So the stakes are literally life and death.
Literally. If you are a single Christian and the Roman guards arrest you, you only have to worry about your own faith. You can face the lions with a clear conscience. But if you are married and the guards threaten to torture your spouse or sell your children into slavery unless you renounce your faith.
Oh, man. The pressure to recant, the agonizing compromise you would have to make.
Paul is trying to spare them that specific horrific torment.
That reframes everything. He isn't anti-marriage. He is fiercely protective of these people in a time of war.
Exactly.
But that brings up another highly complex issue the Corinthians wrote to him about. Mixed marriages.
Ah, yes.
What happens if you are living in Corinth? You hear the gospel, you convert to Christianity, but your spouse doesn't.
Right. They are still going to the temple of Aphrodite.
They are still offering sacrifices to the household gods. The Corinthians were asking, do we need to get a divorce to stay pure? Is our pagan spouse contaminating our faith?
Which is a completely logical question if your entire paradigm of purity is based on avoiding contamination.
True.
Historically, under the Jewish law, there were periods, like in the days of Ezra, where foreign idolatrous wives were strictly put away to preserve the community.
Right.
So the Corinthians are wondering if this is the new protocol. Do we purge the household?
And what does Paul say?
Paul's answer is a resounding, definitive no. If the unbelieving spouse is willing to stay in the marriage, the believer must not initiate a divorce.
Wait, walk me through that.
Yeah.
Because that completely flips the script on how religious purity usually works.
It really does.
Usually it's stay away from the sick person so you don't catch their disease.
Yeah.
Paul is saying, no, you have the cure, stay in the house.
Yes.
He says the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified by the husband.
Right.
Otherwise, your children would be unclean, but now they are holy. What does he mean by sanctified? Because he obviously doesn't mean the pagan spouse is magically saved against their will just by sleeping in the same bed as a Christian.
No, it's not a magical transfer of salvation. The commentators, particularly Matthew Henry, provide a vital clarification here.
Oh.
He says the marriage relation itself is sanctified or made holy and legitimate to the believer. To the pure, all things are pure. Ah, I see.
Living with a pagan spouse, sharing a life with them, does not defile the Christian. The Christian is not rendered unclean by proximity.
So the dynamic flows the other way.
Exactly. The Christian's presence brings a holy, mitigating influence into the home. They are a beachhead of grace in a pagan household.
A beachhead of grace. I like that.
And because of that, the children are considered part of the holy seed. They are raised under the influence of the covenant community rather than being entirely abandoned to the pagan world.
He is telling them to stay and be a light.
Yes.
He asks this hauntingly beautiful question. For what knowest thou, O wife, whether thou shalt save thy husband?
You might be the very instrument God uses to rescue the person you love most.
But Paul is also a realist, and he addresses the darker alternative. What if the unbelieving spouse absolutely hates your new faith?
Right.
What if they maliciously desert you?
In that specific case, Paul provides a clear release valve. He says, a brother or a sister is not under bondage in such cases, but God hath called us to peace.
And so they're released. If the unbeliever violently severs the tie, if they abandon the home because of the Christian's faith, the Christian is released. They are not required to desperately cling to a situation of constant hostility, abuse, or desertion.
Because the overriding principle of the Christian life is peace, not endless domestic warfare.
Correct.
This whole section on marriage and status culminates in a philosophical perspective that I think is deeply challenging for us today.
Oh, absolutely.
Paul says the time is short, and he tells them to live in a way where those who weep are as though they wept not, those who rejoice as though they rejoice not, and those who buy as though they possess not.
And then he drops this massive thesis statement.
Right. For the fashion of this world passeth away.
That word fashion in the original Greek is schema. It means the habit, the figure, the external appearance. It's theatrical language. Matthew Henry describes it as a transient show, or the faint and vanishing appearances of a dream. Paul is saying that all of this, the Roman Empire, the social hierarchy, the wealth of Corinth, the real estate market, your exact societal rank, it is all in a continual state of flux.
It's just a stage set.
Exactly. And the stagehands are already waiting to swap it out for the next scene.
Which is a brutal reality check for our modern anxieties.
It really is.
Think about how much emotional energy you and I spend obsessing over upgrading our status. We agonize over buying a slightly larger house, getting a title promotion at work, or figuring out exactly where we rank in our social circle.
We treat the schema, the stage set, as if it is permanent, ultimate reality.
Yes. And Paul is calling for a holy indifference to the material world. He says, let every man wherein he is called, therein abide with God.
It is the ultimate principle of contentment. Barnes highlights this beautifully in his commentary.
What does he say?
He points out that it is no disgrace to be poor. It is no disgrace to be in a humble rank of life or to work a mundane job. The only actual disgrace is to be out of alignment with God and to constantly complain about the lot you've been given. God orders our circumstances.
And Paul takes this to the absolute extreme by addressing slaves, doesn't he?
He does. He says, if you are called while you are a slave, do not let it consume you with anxiety, because spiritually you are the Lord's freedman.
Wow.
Now, he explicitly adds, if thou mayest be made free, use it rather. He is absolutely not romanticizing slavery. Liberty is practically better. But his core point is that your external, temporary, socioeconomic status does not dictate your internal, eternal spiritual reality.
So when you look at your own life right now, whether you are married, single, a high-level executive, or working an entry-level job just to pay rent, the question is, are you constantly anxiously trying to escape your current season?
Right.
Or can you find a way to abide therein with God? If the fashion of this world really is a fading dream, are you investing all your emotional capital into an illusion? Are your possessions and your ambitions serving a higher purpose, or are they possessing you?
That internal audit is crucial. Because once the Corinthian believers had their private households and their internal anxieties sorted out, they had to step out their front doors.
Out into the chaos.
Exactly. They had to go to work, and when they did, they walked straight into the public marketplace.
And this leads us to chapters 8 and 10, where Paul addresses the explosive tension between knowledge, personal freedom, and love.
Yes. We are moving from the private living room straight into the ancient meat market.
And this brings up a hyper-specific ancient problem that, once you understand the mechanics of it, has profound implications for how we interact today.
It really does.
The dilemma was this. In Corinth, the vast majority of the meat sold in the public markets or served at dinner parties had previously been sacrificed to idols in the pagan temples.
We really need to understand the mechanics of the ancient butcher industry to see why this was such a crisis.
Okay, lay it out.
In the Greco-Roman world, the temples weren't just places of quiet prayer. They were the slaughterhouses and the barbecue joints of the city.
The barbecue joints.
Literally. When a citizen brought a cow or a sheep to the temple of Zeus, the priest took a specific portion for the altar, a portion was burned for the god, and the rest of the meat was either given back to the worshiper to host a feast, or it was sold to the vendors in the public market.
Which was called the misellum.
Right.
Or the shambles.
Exactly, the shambles.
Yeah. So if you are a Christian and you just want to buy some steaks for dinner, or you get invited to your boss's house for a banquet, there is a 90% chance the food on your plate was ritually dedicated to a pagan god an hour ago.
Yep. And that puts you in a terrible bind.
I can imagine.
If you refuse to eat any meat associated with idols, you are effectively cutting yourself off from the social and economic life of the city.
You can't attend guild meetings. You can't go to civic festivals. You basically become a total outcast.
Exactly. The stakes were incredibly high. Now, some of the Corinthian Christians had what they proudly called knowledge. They reasoned through this problem with perfect, cold logic. They said, look, we know there is only one true God. We know that a statue of Apollo is just a piece of carved marble. It is nothing in the world, as Paul quotes them saying.
Right, it's just a rock.
Exactly. Therefore, the meat hasn't been magically infected with spiritual evil. It's just protein. It's just meat.
So, armed with this theological knowledge, they felt completely free to eat it.
They did. And some of them took it a step further. They were actually going into the idol temples and sitting down at the banquets there, flaunting their freedom and showing everyone how enlightened they were.
And here is the twist. Paul completely agrees with their theology.
He does.
He agrees at the premise. He says, yes, an idol is nothing. There is only one God, the Father, and one Lord, Jesus Christ.
Right.
The meat itself is morally neutral. God made the cow, the idol didn't.
Exactly.
However, while he validates their theology, he aggressively dismantles their ethics.
He drops what I think is the central maxim of this entire discussion, a phrase that echoes through history.
What's so?
Knowledge puffs up, but charity edifies. Love builds up.
Oh, that's good.
Let's analyze that phrase. Knowledge puffs up. It creates inflation. It makes person intellectually bloated, windy, and arrogant.
I see this dynamic so clearly in modern culture, particularly on the internet and in intellectual debates.
Oh, for sure.
We live in a society that absolutely worships being technically right. We use our knowledge, our data, our theological exactness as a weapon to win arguments, to dunk on people online, or to stubbornly flaunt our personal freedoms.
Really do.
We say, well, the statistics say this, or technically the Constitution gives me the right to do this, or theologically I am free to behave this way.
Yes.
But Paul is looking at these brilliant, technically correct Corinthians and asking a radically different question. He's asking, does your being right actually build anyone up? Or is it just feeding your own ego?
That is the exact pivot Paul makes. He shifts the focus from the individual's rights to the impact on the community.
How so?
Because he introduces a specific character into this debate, the weak brother. Not everyone in the Corinthian church had this robust, intellectual, bulletproof theology. Some of them were fresh converts who had literally just walked out of the Temple of Aphrodite a month ago.
Oh, wow.
And as Albert Barnes notes in his commentary, the psychological views and the deep-seated superstitions a person entertained from childhood cannot simply be erased overnight by a theological lecture.
Yeah, you can't just flip a switch in your brain.
Exactly. The long and withering influence of their past pagan life still held a terrifying sway over their minds.
Try to imagine the psychology of that.
Go ahead.
Imagine you just escaped a deeply abusive, terrifying cult. You finally break free. And then, a few weeks later, you walk past the cult's headquarters and you see the person who led you out of the cult, sitting on the porch, drinking a beer, laughing with the cult members.
That is a powerful image.
Even if that person says, oh, I'm just enjoying a beverage, I don't believe in the cult anymore, what does that do to your brain?
It shatters you. And that is exactly Paul's point. If a weak brother who still feels a superstitious, terrifying psychological pull toward that idol, sees the strong, knowledgeable Christian sitting in the idol's temple eating the meat, what happens?
The weak brother's conscience is, as Paul says, emboldened.
Emboldened. He thinks, oh, I guess we're still supposed to honor the idols. I guess that's still part of the deal.
Right.
So he sits down and eats the meat, but he doesn't do it with theological freedom. He does it with reverence for the idol. He violates his own fragile conscience, and he plunges right back into the idolatry he just escaped.
All because the strong Christian had to prove how smart and free they were.
Exactly. Paul's indictment here is devastating. He says, and through thy knowledge shall the weak brother perish for whom Christ died. Oof. You are using your intellectual superiority, your rights, to utterly destroy a human being that Jesus bled for.
That's intense. Matthew Henry sums this up with a gut punch of a quote.
What does he say?
He says, that man has very little of the spirit of the Redeemer, who had rather his brother should perish than himself be abridged in any respect of his liberty.
It completely redefines what freedom means.
It really does.
For Paul, Christian freedom is not the autonomy to do whatever you want. True freedom is having the power to voluntarily restrict your rights out of love for someone else.
And Paul makes a stunning personal declaration to prove he means it. He says, wherefore, if meat make my brother to offend, I will eat no flesh while the world standeth.
He would become a lifelong committed vegetarian rather than cause a fellow believer to spiritually stumble.
I'm trying to wrap my head around how this actually works in practice, though.
Okay.
Because if I am constantly terrified of offending every single person's hypersensitive conscience, I'm going to be paralyzed. I won't be able to do anything.
Yeah.
Does Paul expect them to become paranoid ascetics, interrogating every meal they eat?
That is the danger of taking this to a legalistic extreme, but Paul is too smart for that.
Oh.
In chapter 10, he provides a masterclass in applying this wisdom with practical discernment. He gives them 2 highly practical, everyday rules for living in Corinth.
Okay, what's rule number 1?
Rule number 1 regards the public marketplace, the shambles. He tells them, whatsoever is sold in the shambles, that eat, asking no question for conscience sake.
Asking no questions. I love that. Don't be weird about it.
Exactly. Don't interrogate the butcher. Don't ask for the spiritual resume of the cow.
Right.
Why? Because, as Paul quotes the psalm, the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. The meat belongs to the Creator, not to a fake pagan god. Buy your groceries, go home, and eat your dinner in peace.
Okay, so what about rule number 2?
Rule 2 is about the dinner party. Paul says if an unbeliever invites you to a feast and you want to go, which, by the way, implies Christians are allowed to have pagan friends and socialize.
Right, they aren't totally isolated.
Exactly. He says, Eat whatever is put in front of you. Again, ask no questions. Don't sit down at your pagan boss's table and say, excuse me, was this roast beef offered to Hermes? Because if so, I can't eat it.
Just eat the food and be a good guest.
Right.
But, and here's the crucial pivot. What happens if someone at the table makes it an issue? What if a hypersensitive Christian sitting next to you, or even the pagan host testing you, leans over and explicitly says, hey, just so you know, this meat was offered in sacrifice to idols. Then what?
In that exact moment, the context shifts. Paul says, if they point it out, you stop. You put the fork down and you do not eat it.
Even though the meat is still just meat.
Right. And you don't stop because the idol suddenly became real or because the meat became poisoned. You stop entirely for the sake of the person who pointed it out. Paul says, conscience, I say, not thine own, but of the other. You restrict your liberty to protect their spiritual fragility or to avoid giving the pagan host the wrong impression about your faith.
Which naturally leads the intelligent Corinthians to push back. They say, wait a minute, why is my liberty judged by another man's conscience? That doesn't seem fair. Why do I have to eat a salad just because the guy next to me has bad theology?
And the commentators explain this beautifully.
Okay.
It is not that the weak person's conscience gets to dictate universal right and wrong for you. You still know the meat is fine.
Right.
But the supreme law of love requires you to restrict your lawful actions when you clearly foresee they will cause someone else to stumble or misunderstand the gospel.
As Henry points out, you must not claim your personal rights to the ruin of a brother's soul. The ultimate guiding principle, the filter for every decision, is this. Whether therefore ye eat or drink or whatsoever ye do, do all to the glory of God.
That's the filter.
So bringing this into the present moment for you listening, where in your life are you violently insisting on your rights or your freedoms in a way that is actively damaging the people around you?
Good question.
Maybe it's the media you consume, the aggressive way you debate politics on social media, or how you spend your money. Are you puffing yourself up with how technically correct you are while leaving a trail of wounded, alienated people in your wake?
It's a profound challenge.
It is. Do you have the strength to lay down your rights for the good of your neighbor?
And that challenge leads perfectly into the next major section of this text, chapter 9.
Right, because I can hear the Corinthians now.
Oh, yeah. If you are a Corinthian reading this letter, and Paul is telling you to give up your right to eat meat, your right to go to the temple, your right to assert your knowledge, you're going to have a very human reaction.
You're going to look at Paul and say, that is really easy for you to write in a letter, Paul. But do you actually practice what you preach? Do you ever give up your rights?
Put your money where your mouth is, Paul.
Yeah, exactly.
Precisely. And chapter 9 is Paul turning the mirror on his own life. He proves that the renunciation of rights isn't just a theory. It requires intense, deliberate, daily discipline.
So he starts by defending himself.
Yes. He starts by aggressively establishing that he actually has rights that he could demand. He says, am I not an apostle? Am I not free? Specifically, he defends his absolute right to be financially supported by the church for his ministry.
And he builds a watertight, irrefutable case for this.
He really does.
He argues from basic common sense. Who go with a warfare any time at his own charges. Soldiers don't pay for their own weapons and rations, the army pays them.
Right.
He says, who planted the vineyard and eateth not of the fruit thereof? Then he appeals to the law of Moses. Thou shalt not muzzle the mouth of the ox that treadeth out the corn.
Even the animals get to eat while they work.
Right. And finally, he argues from Jesus Christ's own command that those who preach the gospel should make their living from the gospel.
He looks at the Corinthians and says, if we have sown unto you spiritual things, is it a great thing if we shall reap your carnal things?
Meaning, I brought you eternal life. Is it really a big deal if you pay for my groceries?
Exactly. His legal and moral right to demand a salary is undeniable. And yet, having built this massive case, he completely renounces it.
He does it all up.
He says, but I have used none of these things. Instead of taking their money, he chose to work a grueling manual labor job as a tent maker.
Supporting himself with his own calloused hands.
Working with leather, smelling like animal hides, lowering himself in the social hierarchy. Why would he do that?
Why?
He tells them, lest we should hinder the gospel of Christ.
He knew the culture of Corinth.
He knew it well.
He knew that traveling philosophers and sophists were constantly coming through the city, charging exorbitant fees for their speeches, just trying to get rich off the gullible locals.
Right.
Paul refused to let anyone accuse him of peddling the gospel for cash. He valued the unquestioned integrity of the mission more than his own financial comfort.
He even says it would be better for him to die than to have his glorying, his joy in offering the gospel for free taken away.
Wow.
He isn't boasting about how great he is. He's trying to show them the mindset required to live a life of sacrificial love.
The discipline required.
Exactly. And to really drive this home, to explain the sheer psychological and physical discipline required to voluntarily give up your rights, he uses an analogy that the Corinthians would have understood on a visceral sensory level.
The games.
He talks about the games.
The Isthmian Games. This is such a cool historical detail from our sources.
It really is.
These games were held right outside Corinth every 2 years. In the ancient world, they were second only to the Olympics in prestige and scale.
They were massive. The events included sprinting, long-distance running, throwing the quoit, javelin darting, boxing, cancration, which was a brutal, almost no-rules fighting event.
Yikes.
The athletes who competed in and won these games were the ultimate celebrities of the ancient world. They were heroes.
And Paul taps directly into that local cultural obsession.
He says, "Know ye not that they which run in a race run all, but one receiveth the prize? So run that ye may obtain."
And the training for these games was not a hobby. It was agonizing.
Very much so.
The historical sources quote the Stoic philosopher Epictetus, describing the regimen of an ancient athlete.
What did it take?
If you wanted to compete, you couldn't just show up. You had to observe a painfully strict diet. You had to abstain from all delicacies and desserts.
So no cheat days.
No cheat days. You had to exercise to the point of exhaustion in the blistering summer heat and the freezing cold. You couldn't drink cold water when you were thirsty, and you had to completely give up wine.
Wow.
You essentially handed your entire life and autonomy over to a trainer, like a patient yielding to a physician.
It was total surrender of bodily autonomy for the sake of a goal.
Exactly.
And Paul asks the obvious question, why did they do it? What was the grand prize that justified all of this torture?
Paul says they do it to obtain a corruptible crown.
In the Isthmian Games, they didn't get solid gold medals. The victor's wreath was made of withered celery plants.
Celery.
Or sometimes pine branches. It was literally a handful of weeds that would wilt and crumble to dust in a matter of weeks.
They endured years of agony for a fading wreath of celery.
And Paul contrasts this absurdity with the Christian's pursuit. But we, an incorruptible.
His logic is piercing here.
It is. If a pagan athlete will put themselves through hell for a dying weed just to get some temporary applause, what level of discipline should we be willing to endure for eternal glory, for the salvation of souls?
This is where Paul's language becomes intensely vivid and personal.
Yeah, he shifts from watching the athletes to stepping into the arena himself.
Right.
He says, "I therefore so run, not as uncertainly." He isn't just jogging aimlessly around the track. He has his eyes locked on the finish line. Every step has purpose.
And then he switches to the boxing metaphor.
So fight I, not as one that beateth the air.
Shadow boxing. He's saying he isn't just swinging wildly at an imaginary opponent to look tough. Every single blow has a specific target.
Exactly.
But I want to pause here and push back on the very next phrase he uses, because I read this and it sounds incredibly harsh, almost disturbing to modern ears.
Okay, what's the phrase?
He says, "But I keep under my body and bring it into subjection." The commentary notes that the original Greek word here is hupopiazo.
Yes.
And that literally translates to strike under the eye or to give your body a black eye.
It does.
Hold on. Is he actually telling them to physically harm themselves? Is this promoting a masochistic, abusive relationship with our own bodies? Because if someone said that today, we'd recommend them for psychiatric evaluation.
It's a completely valid reaction, and it's a vital question to answer. But no, Paul is not promoting self-harm.
Okay, good.
And he isn't saying the physical body is inherently evil again. He rejects that Greek dualism we talked about earlier.
Right.
The commentators are very careful to clarify this. Much like Stoic philosophy or the extreme regimen of an elite Olympic athlete today, Paul is using violent imagery to describe internal psychological mastery.
Psychological mastery.
He is saying that our base appetites, our primal cravings for comfort, for excess food, for illicit sex, for laziness, cannot be allowed to steer the ship.
So the body makes a wonderful servant, but a terrible destructive master.
Exactly. If you let your bodily appetites dictate your choices, if you always hit the snooze button, if you always eat the extra meal, if you always give in to the sexual urge, you will never achieve the discipline required for the mission.
You will be enslaved by your own impulses.
Right. He disciplines his body. He brings his desires into subjection to prove that he is not under the dominion of evil passions, but under the dominion of the gospel.
Wow.
And he does this because he is deeply afraid of a specific outcome. He says, "Lest that by any means, when I have preached to others, I myself should be a castaway."
A castaway, that's a haunting word. The Greek word there is adokimos.
Yes, and it's actually a metallurgical term.
Like metalworking.
Yeah. In the ancient world, when they were refining silver or gold, they would test the metal. If it didn't pass the test, if it was found to be base, full of impurities, and worthless, it was adokimos. It was rejected.
Slag metal. Thrown on the scrap heap.
Exactly. Paul, the great apostle, is expressing a profound, holy fear. He is giving his entire life to preaching the gospel, but he knows that if he abandons his discipline, if he yields to his fleshly appetites and lives a life of hypocrisy, he could end up disqualified.
Disapproved by the ultimate judge.
He could lose his effectiveness and his reward.
That is incredibly sobering. Think about your own life trajectory right now. Are you just shadowboxing through your days? You are busy, you are exhausted, your calendar is full, but what are you actually aiming at? Are you expending all your energy with no real eternal target?
And look at the fading wreaths you are rigorously training for.
Yeah. Are you meticulously disciplining yourself, working 80 hours a week, destroying your health just to get a promotion at a job you don't even like?
Are you agonizing over social media clout or temporary wealth?
We train so hard for things that will crumble to dust while entirely neglecting the incorruptible things, our character, our integrity, our soul, and our impact on the people around us.
It is a profound question of ultimate priorities. And this brings us to the final and perhaps most volatile section of our deep dive, chapter 11.
All right, let's get into it.
We've looked at how Paul addresses the private home and marriage. We've looked at the public marketplace and the idol meet. We've looked at internal personal discipline.
Right.
Now, Paul turns his attention to what happens when all these diverse, messy Corinthian believers actually gather together in one room for communal worship.
And he immediately wades into an issue that is highly charged, both then and now. Gender roles, authority, and head coverings.
Yes. And as we discuss this, we need to navigate it with careful wisdom and historical discernment.
Absolutely.
Looking closely at what the text actually says, and crucially, what the cultural context of the first century Mediterranean world was.
Just to be clear for you listening, as we unpack this, our goal here is not to endorse a specific modern political or cultural viewpoint.
No, absolutely not. We're just looking at the text.
We are acting as guides, impartially conveying the ideas contained in this ancient text to understand what they meant to the people in that room and to see what underlying principle might remain for us today.
Exactly. The historical situation is this. Some of the women in the Corinthian church, when they were praying or prophesying aloud in the public assembly, were intentionally throwing off their veils.
They were worshiping bareheaded.
Yes. Paul strongly reprimands this practice. He builds a theological argument appealing to the creation order, arguing that man is the image and glory of God, and the woman is the glory of the man.
Okay.
Therefore, he argues, women should wear veils when leading in prayer or prophecy, and men should pray uncovered.
And he uses very strong language here, doesn't he?
Very strong. He says that for a woman to pray uncovered is as shameful as having her head completely shaved, which was often a punishment for adultery in that era.
Okay, I really need you to help translate this, because to a modern listener, a hat is just a hat. A scarf is just a scarf. It's just fabric. Why is Paul getting so intensely worked up about an accessory? Is this essentially about cultural languages of respect and communication?
It is profoundly about what clothing communicates in a specific cultural matrix. In first century Corinth, the veil was not just a fashion choice.
Oh, was it?
It was the universally recognized, deeply ingrained symbol of modesty, propriety, and a woman's honored but subordinate relation to her husband within the social order.
Oh, I see.
As the commentator Albert Barnes notes, for a woman to intentionally lay aside her veil in a public gathering was synonymous with actively shedding her modesty.
Wow.
Or publicly claiming a domineering, rebellious superiority over her husband and the community.
Try to think of a modern equivalent.
Oh, brings to mind.
It's like,
yeah.
Imagine if someone today showed up to a very formal, somber, traditional funeral wearing a neon pink bikini.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Or if someone walked into a bank wearing a full ski mask. The fabric itself, the nylon or the wool, has absolutely no inherent moral value. It's morally neutral.
Right.
But the message that clothing choice communicates in that specific cultural context is one of profound disrespect, rebellion, or threat.
That is a very apt analogy. What was likely happening is that the Corinthian women, having discovered their radical new spiritual equality and freedom in Christ.
Right. Remember Paul said earlier they have mutual authority in marriage.
Exactly. But they were abusing that freedom. They were using the worship gathering to aggressively flout the established social order in a way that brought unnecessary public shame on the church and their families.
It was turning the worship service into a distracting social protest.
But crucially, Paul balances his theological argument. Lest the men read this and become arrogant or tyrannical, he immediately adds a profound theological counterweight.
What does he say?
He says, "Nevertheless, neither is the man without the woman, neither the woman without the man in the Lord."
Mutual dependence. He brings it right back to symmetry.
Exactly. He reminds them they are fundamentally essential to each other. For as the woman is of the man, even so is the man also by the woman, but all things of God.
So the enduring wisdom we can extract from this isn't about desperately trying to enforce first-century Mediterranean dress codes in a 21st century city.
No, definitely not.
It's about maintaining order, honoring our mutual dependence on one another, and approaching the worship of God with reverence.
The gathering is not a platform for social rebellion, drawing attention to oneself, or intentionally causing cultural offense.
But as controversial as the head coverings might seem, that was actually the minor issue in their gatherings.
Oh, yeah. Paul then pivots to an even bigger, much more deeply damaging scandal, their practice of the Lord's Supper.
Yes. This is the section where Paul's tone shifts to pure righteous anger.
He says, "Now in this that I declare unto you, I praise you not."
The Lord's Supper, or communion, was instituted by Jesus to be the ultimate, visible symbol of Christian unity.
It was a remembrance of his sacrifice. In the early church, it was often celebrated not just with a tiny wafer, but as part of a larger communal meal called an agape feast, or a love feast.
But the Corinthians, being Corinthians, had turned this beautiful symbol of unity into a fractured, humiliating, gluttonous disaster.
They absolutely desecrated it. Remember the extreme socioeconomic divide in Corinth we talked about earlier?
The merchants and the poor laborers.
Exactly. You had very wealthy merchants, property owners and patrons, and you also had slaves, dock workers, and day laborers.
Right.
In a Roman house church, the gathering would happen in the villa of a wealthy patron. What was happening was that the wealthy members, who controlled their own schedules and didn't have to work till sundown, were arriving at the gathering early.
Okay, I see where this is going.
They brought massive amounts of their own rich food and expensive wine. And instead of waiting for the rest of the church to arrive so they could share a unified meal, they were gorging themselves.
Oh.
By the time the poor laborers and slaves arrived, exhausted, dirty, and genuinely hungry after a long day of hard labor, the food was completely gone.
The text is brutally blunt about this. Paul says, one is hungry and another is drunken.
The rich are literally getting drunk in the dining room while the poor are standing in the courtyard with empty stomachs. It's appalling.
It is the total antithesis of what Jesus commanded. Paul is furious. He tells them, when ye come together, therefore, into one place, this is not to eat the Lord's Supper.
He's saying, I don't care what songs you are singing or what prayers you are reciting, whatever you think you are doing, you aren't doing communion. You are just having a selfish dinner party.
Because they had completely, violently missed the point of the bread and the cup.
Yeah, Paul takes them all the way back to the foundation. He reminds them of the solemn night Jesus was betrayed. He reminds them of the bread broken for them.
The cup of the new covenant in his blood.
He says, "For as often as ye eat this bread and drink this cup, ye do show the Lord's death till he come." This is a sacred proclamation, not a frat party.
And because of the sacred nature of the meal, he issues a terrifying warning.
Yeah. He says that whoever eats this bread and drinks this cup unworthily is guilty of the body and blood of the Lord. And he says they eat and drink damnation or severe judgment to themselves, not discerning the Lord's body.
Let's unpack that specific phrase, not discerning the Lord's body. Because I think modern Christians often misinterpret this.
How so?
We tend to individualize it. We think eating unworthily means, did I have a wandering mind during the church service? Did I forget to confess a sin this morning? Do I feel sad enough right now?
Right. It becomes this neurotic internal guilt trip.
But in the context of what was actually happening in Corinth, it's so much bigger and more outward than that, isn't it?
It is entirely communal. To fail to discern the Lord's body in this specific context means failing to recognize the church community itself as the physical manifestation of the body of Christ on earth. It means treating your fellow believers, especially the poor ones, with contempt. When the rich Christians ate all the food, got drunk, and left the poor slaves to starve in the courtyard, they were ripping apart the very body that the broken bread was supposed to unify.
They were showing contempt for the people Jesus died for.
Exactly. Matthew Henry notes that this communal selfishness was so offensive to God that it resulted in actual physical judgments upon the church.
Physical judgment.
Paul says, "For this cause many are weak and sickly among you, and many sleep," which is a euphemism for death. God was fiercely physically protecting the purity of this sacrament from being mocked.
That is terrifying.
And Paul's solution to this crisis is profound in its simplicity. But let a man examine himself. Before you reach out your hand to take the bread, stop. Look at your own heart, yes, but also look around the room.
Look at how you are treating the people in your community.
Are you ignoring the poor? Are you creating divisions based on status? He says, for if we would judge ourselves, we should not be judged.
The insight here is so piercing. Before you claim to be part of a spiritual community, before you take part in religious rituals, examine how you treat the people within that community who have the absolute least status, wealth, or power.
True spirituality isn't just about your private vertical relationship with God.
It is deeply, unavoidably horizontal and communal. You cannot claim to love the head of the church while you are actively starving the body of the church.
Exactly. The way you treat the most vulnerable, easily ignored person in your community is the truest, most accurate reflection of your actual understanding of the gospel.
Which brings us to the end of our deep dive today. We've covered a massive amount of ground, from the intimacy of the marriage bed, to the complex ethics of the marketplace, to the grueling discipline of the athlete, to the sacred unity of the communion table.
It's been an incredible journey through the text.
I want to leave you, the listener, with a final reflection to mull over as you go back into your own complex world. The Corinthians were people who fiercely prided themselves on being the most free, the most enlightened, and the most knowledgeable people around.
They really did.
They lived in a cosmopolitan city of boundless options, massive wealth, and immense intellectual pride. But across these 5 chapters, Paul takes their entire worldview and turns it completely upside down.
He flips it.
He shows them, and us, that true freedom isn't the autonomous ability to do whatever you want, whenever you want, just because you technically have the right to do it.
Right.
True freedom is having the supernatural power to voluntarily bind yourself to the service of love.
And true wisdom isn't having a bloated, arrogant intellect that can win any theological argument online.
True wisdom is recognizing how little you actually know and choosing to lay down your rights, your privileges, and your comforts to build other people up instead.
It really is the stark difference between drowning in the muddy, chaotic waters of self-interest and choosing to walk in the clear, life-giving stream of sacrificial love.
That's the heart of this section. This is Wisdom for the Present, where understanding leads to clarity, and clarity shapes how we see and live. We'll see you in the next episode.